The most dangerous myth about Titan is not that it vanished, it is that the ocean kept the answer hidden. For days, the public story seemed to be a story of absence. A craft somewhere in the North Atlantic. 5 people out of reach. A countdown of breathable air repeated across news broadcasts. A search spreading over a cold, immense surface above the Titanic wreck site. But in the official record, there is another sound running underneath that memory. Not a voice, not a distress call, not a hidden tape from inside the hull, but a distant acoustic trace, recorded far from the wreck site, later treated by investigators as the suspected signature of Catastrophe. That contradiction is where the archive begins. The legend says a missing submarine returned empty, with 88 hours of voices still recording. It is a powerful image because it borrows from older sea stories. A vessel comes back without its people. A machine preserves what the dead could not. The deep ocean becomes not just a grave, but a recorder. It sounds like the kind of mystery that should arrive in a sealed evidence box with magnetic tape inside, waiting for someone brave enough to press play. But that is not the documented case. Titan was not a conventional submarine. It did not return empty. Official sources do not support any claim of 88 hours of recorded human voices. The number 88 belongs to something else. It was the dive number. The U.S. Coast Guard factual presentation identifies the incident dive as Dive 88, a privately operated expedition descent toward the wreck of RMS Titanic. The craft was Titan, operated by OceanGate Expeditions. The support vessel was MV Polar Prince, operating from St. John's, Newfoundland and Labrador. The date was June 18, 2023. What followed became one of the most closely watched deep-sea emergencies of modern times. But to understand what is known and what is only rumor, the first step is to separate the shape of the story from the shape of the evidence. The documented mystery does not need an empty submarine drifting back from the abyss. It is already unsettling enough. A passenger-carrying submersible descended toward one of the most famous wreck sites on Earth. Communications and tracking were lost space. Search aircraft, ships, remotely operated vehicles, and command centers moved into action. And later, investigators would point to a passive acoustic recording made by an NOAAS moored instrument about 900 miles away from the implosion site. 900 miles is the detail that can make the case feel unreal. Not because it suggests secret voices survived in the hull, but because it shows how the ocean can carry certain kinds of violence farther than human expectation. A structural failure at extreme depth is not a whispered event. A pressure vessel failing in the deep ocean is a sudden exchange between engineered space and overwhelming water pressure. The official record describes an implosion, not a disappearance into silence. The difference matters. A voice recorder implies duration. It suggests waiting, fear, messages, testimony. It invites the imagination to fill in what no official source has released and no cited record supports. A passive acoustic recorder is something else entirely. The NOAA and National Park Service Ocean Noise Reference Station Network uses passive acoustic monitoring to measure long-term ocean ambient sound. Such instruments listen to the ocean environment. They are not onboard recorders. They are not communication devices inside a submersible. They do not preserve cabin conversations from a destroyed pressure vessel. In this case, the recording mattered because it may have captured the sound of the catastrophic event itself. So the wrong legend has to be set down before the real archive can be opened. There was no intact Titan returning to port without its occupants. On June 22, 2023, a remotely operated vehicle from Pelagic Research Services found Titan's aft tail cone and other debris on the seafloor at about 10:50 local time. The debris field transformed the public understanding of the event. The search for a missing craft became confirmation of catastrophic pressure chamber failure. All 5 people aboard died: Stockton Rush, Paul Henry Nargeolet, Shahzada Dawood, Suleiman Dawood, and Hamish Harding. Even in that list of names, there is a responsibility to keep the archive clean. The record identifies them as the 5 occupants aboard Titan on Dive 88. It does not give us permission to invent private conversations, last words, or a final 88-hour recording. The temptation to do that is part of why the rumor version spreads. It gives the disaster a script. It turns uncertainty into dialogue. But the true record is colder, more technical, and in some ways more frightening. The final known contacts were not long speeches. They were operational messages and tracking data. Later chapters will follow those times carefully because the times matter. The crew boarded in the morning. Titan disengaged from its launch platform. The descent continued. A final documented message was sent. A final ping was recorded. Then Polar Prince sent a lost tracking message and received no response. That is the framework investigators had to work with. A support vessel on the surface, a submersible descending toward Titanic's depth, a loss of communication and tracking, debris found days later, and acoustic evidence consistent with a sudden catastrophic event. The wrong legend usually begins with the word submarine. That word carries its own imagery: naval steel, independent underwater travel, a vessel built to operate across oceans with its own systems, crew, and command structure. Titan was different. Official materials describe a submersible, a small passenger-carrying craft built around a pressure vessel for human occupancy. The distinction is not pedantic. It changes the whole geometry of risk. A submersible like Titan depended on a surface operation. It relied on launch and recovery support. It was tied to Polar Prince and to procedures above the waterline, even as it traveled into a depth where ordinary rescue options narrowed almost to nothing. This is why the case belongs in an archive report rather than a ghost story. The evidence is not vague. It is fragmented, technical, and incomplete in the way disaster evidence often is, but it is not a blank space. The U.S. Coast Guard, the National Transportation Safety Board, NOAA, and other institutions left a trail of findings, factual presentations, vessel particulars, coordinates, messages, and conclusions. The NTSB later focused on the pressure vessel, including carbon fiber composite construction with titanium domes and rings. Its findings addressed delamination, local buckling failure, and implosion. The Coast Guard Marine Board of Investigation later stated that the loss of 5 lives was preventable. Those conclusions belong later in the story. For now, the opening question is simpler and harder. Why did the false version become so durable when the documented version is already so stark? Part of the answer is that the real case contains elements that sound almost mythic when removed from context. Titanic, the deep North Atlantic. A private expedition. A craft named Titan. Dive 88. A search for survivors. A sound recorded 900 miles away. Each fragment can be bent into legend. 88 becomes ours. A distant acoustic recorder becomes an onboard voice archive. A debris discovery becomes an empty return. The ocean's evidence becomes a secret message. But the official record points in a different direction. It points toward an event that likely ended not with hours of recorded voices, but with a sudden failure of the pressure hull. It points toward the limits of deep-sea technology, the consequences of design and oversight decisions, and the brutal physics of operating near the Titanic wreck site. It points toward a mystery not of what was said in a doomed cabin for 88 hours, but of how a vessel built to carry people into the deep reached a point where the ocean overwhelmed it. The archive does not take away the unease. It sharpens it, because if the ocean did not hide the answer, then the question changes. The mystery is no longer whether Titan was lost in a long, silent waiting period beneath the sea. The mystery becomes how much was already knowable from the first moment of failure, how that knowledge moved through institutions and search operations, and how a submersible built for extreme depth came to be descending toward Titanic on Dive 88. To follow that trail, the next distinction has to be made with care. Titan was not the kind of vessel many people imagined when they first heard the word submarine. It was smaller, more dependent, and more closely bound to the ship above it than the legend allows. The surface vessel, the launch platform, the pressure vessel for human occupancy, these are not background details. They are the operating world Titan came from, and the first map of what could go wrong. That operating world begins with a word that sounds technical, but changes the shape of the entire story. Submersible, not submarine. The difference can seem small at first, especially in public conversation. Both go underwater. Both carry people into a place where air, pressure, navigation, and communication become matters of survival. Both can disappear from ordinary view as soon as the surface closes above them. But in the archive of Titan, the distinction is not decorative. It is structural. It tells us what kind of machine this was, what it depended on, and why the vessel above it mattered almost as much as the craft below. A conventional ocean-going submarine is built around independence. It is a vessel in its own right, designed to operate under its own power for extended periods, with systems for navigation, endurance, control, and survival contained within the hull. The public imagination often fills in that image automatically, a long steel form moving through the deep, crewed like a ship, self-contained, capable of traveling great distances beneath the sea. Titan was not that. Titan was a submersible operated by OceanGate Expeditions for dives to the RMS Titanic wreck site. In the National Transportation Safety Board vessel particulars, the owner and operator are identified as Cyclops II Incorporated and OceanGate Expeditions. It was a small passenger-carrying craft built around a pressure vessel for human occupancy, not an independent submarine roaming the Atlantic. The U.S. Coast Guard and the National Transportation Safety Board records place it within a support operation, surface vessel, launch and recovery system, communications, tracking, crew transfer, and recovery all working together as a chain. That chain is the first quiet fact to hold in mind. Titan's world did not begin at the moment it slipped beneath the water. It began at the surface in the systems that carried it, launched it, monitored it, and were supposed to bring it back. The support vessel was the MV Polar Prince, a Canadian-flagged vessel operating from St. John's, Newfoundland, and Labrador. In the final expedition, Polar Prince was not just nearby scenery. It was the surface partner in the operation, the ship from which the dive was supported and monitored. Communications and tracking connected Titan below to people above. The Launch and Recovery System, often abbreviated as LARS in technical records, was the platform used to put Titan into the water and recover it afterward. That arrangement matters because a submersible like Titan was not meant to function as a standalone vessel in the way the word submarine often implies. It relied on another vessel to carry it to the dive area. It relied on a launch platform for deployment. It relied on the surface operation to follow its progress. And when something went wrong, the first signs of trouble would be understood through that same relationship: messages, pings, tracking, and then the absence of response. The archive is full of such plain words. Support vessel, launch platform, tracking, disengaged, lost contact. Each one sounds almost administrative until it becomes the only way to measure the last known moments of a craft miles from shore and thousands of meters down. Titan itself was small by the standards of what many people picture when they hear submarine. The National Transportation Safety Board lists Titan as approximately 22 feet long and 9.2 feet wide. Its build year is listed as 2020. It could carry up to 5 persons, including 1 pilot. That detail will matter later when the official record names the 5 occupants of Dive 88. But even here, before the names enter the story, the number defines the scale of the vessel. This was not a military boat with compartments and a large crew. It was a compact, deep-diving submersible arranged around the pressure boundary that separated human life from the sea. The phrase used in the technical record is pressure vessel for human occupancy. It is a clinical phrase, but a useful one. It focuses attention where attention belongs. At Titanic depth, the central question is not whether a craft looks like a submarine, or whether it has lights, cameras, thrusters, or a name painted on its side. The central question is whether the pressure vessel can maintain a survivable interior while the ocean presses inward from every direction. Titan's pressure vessel used carbon fiber composite construction with titanium domes and rings. Those materials belong to the engineering archive that will become more important later when investigators describe delamination, local buckling failure, and implosion. For now, the basic point is simpler. Titan was a passenger-carrying submersible organized around a pressure chamber. Everything outside that chamber belonged to the working body of the craft. Everything inside it belonged to the fragile space where people could breathe. This is why the language of missing submarine misleads. It suggests a vessel with a certain kind of autonomy, a certain kind of maritime identity, a certain ability to operate independently of a ship above. Titan's actual operating model was different. It was tied to an expedition system. It was dependent on a surface vessel. It had to be launched, followed, communicated with, and recovered. Even the route into the story is therefore not only downward, but outward, from St. John's, Newfoundland and Labrador into the North Atlantic, from Polar Prince to the launch and recovery system, from the platform to the water, from surface contact to deep descent. The factual record also tells us what Titan was not in a regulatory sense. The National Transportation Safety Board states that Titan was not registered in any U.S. state, was not documented by the U.S. National Vessel Documentation Center, and was not inspected by any flag state. Those points do not need embellishment to sound serious. They sit quietly in the file, part of the larger question of oversight for novel passenger-carrying submersibles and deep ocean operations. But the immediate narrative consequence is this: Titan's identity cannot be understood by borrowing the assumptions that come with naval submarines or large certified passenger vessels. Its world was more particular than that. It belonged to private expedition diving, to a company taking passengers to a famous deep-sea wreck, to a support ship in the North Atlantic, and to a pressure vessel design that investigators would later place at the center of the casualty end. OceanGate expeditions presented these dives as journeys to the Titanic wreck site. That destination gave the operation its pull, its prestige, and its risk. But before reaching the wreck, before any camera light could fall on the broken remains of the liner, the submersible had to pass through a long sequence of ordinary technical dependence. It had to be carried out from port. It had to be prepared. It had to be launched. It had to descend while the surface team tracked it. It had to remain a functioning pressure vessel in a part of the ocean where the environment allowed almost no forgiveness. The support vessel's role also shaped the way time would later be reconstructed. The Coast Guard factual presentation identifies the casualty dive as Dive 88. It records that the crew boarded Titan at about 8:30 in the morning local time, and that Titan disengaged from the launch platform at 9:14. Those times belong to a later chapter in the sequence, but they show why the platform and surface operation cannot be treated as background. The start of the dive was not simply a hatch closing. It was a formal transition from being supported at the surface to being tracked through descent and growth. And once that transition occurred, the surface vessel became the point of human contact with a craft moving into a world where direct rescue would be extraordinarily difficult. The Polar Prince was the vessel hearing from Titan, watching for its signals, and later sending the message that no one wanted to send: lost tracking. That moment is still ahead in the archive. But its meaning begins here, with the basic operating fact that Titan was a submersible dependent on the system above it. The word submersible also narrows the mystery in a useful way. It strips away the dramatic but inaccurate image of a self-contained submarine lost somewhere in the ocean, wading through a long, unseen ordeal. It brings us back to a smaller craft, a defined dive, a known support vessel, a launch and recovery platform, and a pressure vessel carrying human occupants toward a known target. That target was not an abstract coordinate. It was the RMS Titanic wreck site, southeast of St. John's, Newfoundland and Labrador, in the deep North Atlantic. It was a place already heavy with memory before Titan ever entered the water. The wreck lay at extreme depth, far below ordinary human access, in a cold and pressurized landscape where the difference between a successful dive and a fatal failure could be measured in engineering assumptions. So the archive asks us to hold two images at once. Above, the Polar Prince, the surface operation, the launch and recovery system, the human world of checklists, messages, and monitoring. Below, Titan, a 22-foot submersible built around a pressure vessel for human occupancy, descending toward one of the most famous wrecks on Earth. Between them was the line that made the whole expedition possible, and beyond them was the depth that made every weakness matter. The line between the Polar Prince and Titan did not lead into empty water. It led toward a known place, a named place, a place that had been mapped, visited, photographed, studied, argued over, and mourned for decades before Dive 88 began. The destination was the RMS Titanic wreck site. In the official records, the geography is practical. The National Transportation Safety Board describes the casualty location as about 370 nautical miles southeast of St. John's, Newfoundland and Labrador, Canada. The Coast Guard materials place the Titanic expedition area in the North Atlantic, near latitude 41 degrees, 43.980 minutes north, and longitude 049 degrees, 56.900 minutes west. Those coordinates have the clean look of archive language. They reduce the ocean to a position. They make the site searchable, chartable, and reportable. But the Titanic wreck is not just a coordinate. It is a deep water memorial. It is an archaeological landscape. It is the broken remains of a ship that sank in April of 1912, scattered across the seabed more than 2 miles beneath the surface. It is also a place where human ambition keeps returning, drawn by history, technology, grief, fame, science, and the difficult promise of seeing with one's own eyes what most people know only through images. For Titan, that pull mattered. The submersible was not descending for a general deep ocean test. It was not simply going downward to prove a number. It was part of an expedition to a particular wreck, one of the most famous in the world, lying in a part of the Atlantic where distance and depth combined to narrow the margin for error. The support vessel had sailed out from St. John's, a North Atlantic port shaped by offshore work, weather, and long routes into difficult water. From there, the expedition moved southeast, out toward a site far from ordinary rescue infrastructure and far beyond ordinary diving depths. At the surface, the sea can conceal that reality. A support vessel on the North Atlantic may look like it is operating in open water, exposed to weather, swell, and distance, but still inside the familiar world of ships, radios, watches, and engines. People can stand on deck. They can see the horizon. They can look at the weather and talk to one another in air. The danger is visible enough to be respected, but not always visible enough to be understood. The deeper danger begins below. The Coast Guard presentation lists the approximate depth of the Titanic wreck as 3,355 meters, or 11,007 feet. Titan's final recorded ping, later in the official timeline, would be documented at an approximate depth of 3,346 meters. Those numbers are close enough to show the operating environment clearly. Titan was not near the depth of a recreational dive. It was not near the depth of a commercial diver in a hard hat. It was not in a place where a rescue diver could descend, inspect, attach a line, or open a hatch. At that depth, the ocean is not merely dark. It is force. Pressure is the defining condition. Every square inch of a pressure boundary is being pressed inward by the weight of the water above. The deeper the descent, the less forgiving the environment becomes. A small weakness does not remain small because the sea is patient. A design assumption does not remain theoretical because the water is indifferent. At Titanic depth, the surrounding ocean turns engineering into survival. That is why the phrase "pressure vessel for human occupancy" carries so much weight in the investigation record. It sounds formal, almost bureaucratic, but it names the central bargain. Human beings can enter the deep ocean only by taking a pocket of surface conditions with them. They sit inside a pressure boundary that must resist the sea long enough to descend, operate, and return. Outside that boundary, the water pressure belongs to another world. Inside it, for as long as the structure holds, people can breathe. Titan's pressure vessel would later become the focus of the National Transportation Safety Board's investigation, especially its carbon fiber composite construction with titanium domes and rings. That engineering story belongs later in the archive, but the setting explains why it matters before the failure is ever examined. A pressure hull near the Titanic wreck site is not working in a symbolic environment. It is working in one of the most severe human-accessible operating environments on Earth. There is another reason the Titanic site changes the shape of the story. It is not an empty test range. It is a wreck field. The remains of Titanic rest in a deep-sea landscape shaped by the sinking, by decay, by ocean processes, and by decades of documentation and visitation. Expeditions to the site have treated it as history, as science, as memorial, and sometimes as spectacle. Each return to the wreck carries the weight of the first disaster. The ship that was once described through confidence and scale became, after 1912, a warning about certainty. It became a reminder that technology can be impressive and still be vulnerable, that expert systems can fail, and that distance from help can turn a failure into a catastrophe. Titan's final voyage moved through that shadow. This does not mean the two disasters are the same. They are not. Titanic was a transatlantic passenger liner. Titan was a privately operated submersible. The ship struck an iceberg and sank on the surface route between continents. The submersible descended more than a century later toward the wreck as part of an expedition. The technologies, regulatory worlds, and sequences of events are different, but the location creates a historical echo that is hard to ignore. The wreck site is a place people approach knowing in advance that it is tied to loss. It asks visitors to treat the seabed as both evidence and grave. It holds artifacts of a disaster that became global memory. And because it lies so deep, it also demands machines capable of surviving conditions no human body can survive unaided. To go there is to enter a memorial through an engineering system. For investigators, however, the romance of the destination cannot be allowed to blur the physical facts. The Atlantic southeast of Newfoundland and Labrador is remote. Search assets take time to reach it. Weather and sea state can complicate surface operations. Communication with a submersible at depth is limited compared with the ordinary communications of ships and aircraft. Tracking depends on systems that can fail, degrade, or be lost. Recovery is not a matter of simply sending people down. At Titanic depth, the equipment capable of reaching the seafloor is specialized. Remotely operated vehicles, deep water sonar, heavy lift planning, and coordination between agencies become part of the operational picture. This is why the public idea of a missing submarine was never quite accurate. The conditions around the Titanic wreck made the case both more specific and more severe. Titan was a small submersible tied to a surface operation, descending toward a known deep ocean site. If contact was lost, the problem would not resemble a lost vessel on the surface. It would become a deep water emergency with very few good options. And if the pressure vessel failed, there would be no rescue at all. That fact is harsh, but it is central to understanding the official record. Deep ocean rescue depends on the survival of the craft and the people inside it. A disabled submersible at depth presents one kind of crisis. A catastrophic implosion presents another. The first leaves open the possibility, however difficult, that the vessel remains intact somewhere below. The second ends the human emergency at the moment of structural failure, even if the surface world does not yet know it. On June 18, 2023, the surface world did not immediately know. That uncertainty would become part of the story. The search, the messages, the assumptions, the waiting, the distant acoustic record, and finally, the debris on the seafloor. But before those later archive points can be understood, the place itself has to be understood. Titan was operating near a wreck site whose depth placed it beyond ordinary intervention. The descent was not simply a trip downward. It was a movement into a zone where the ocean does not permit improvisation. In that zone, materials matter. Inspection matters. Communication matters. Launch and recovery matter. Emergency planning matters. Every choice made before the dive travels down with the vessel. Every uncertainty is carried into pressure. The Titanic wreck has always had a strange pull because it feels both distant and close. It is far away in the North Atlantic, far below the reach of sunlight, and far back in history. Yet it remains vivid in public memory. Its name can make a technical expedition seem like a pilgrimage. It can make a deep-sea operation feel like contact with the past. It can make risk appear meaningful, even when meaning does not reduce risk. That is the quiet tension around Dive 88. The destination was famous, but fame did not make it safer. The site was studied, but study did not make the depth forgiving. The wreck was known, but the water above it remained immense. Titan's route toward Titanic passed from the organized world of the Polar Prince into a place where the archive would soon depend on fragments, a last message, a final ping, a lost tracking call, an acoustic signature, a debris field. Before any of that, there were 5 people preparing to enter a submersible designed to carry up to 5 persons, including 1 pilot. In the Coast Guard factual presentation, they are not rumors or symbols. They are named individuals in an official record: Stockton Rush, Paul Henry Nargiolet, Shahzada Dawood, Suleiman Dawood, and Hamish Harding. The wreck drew the expedition outward from St. John's and downward into the North Atlantic. The next part of the record narrows from place to persons, from the pull of Titanic to the 5 who boarded Titan for its final dive. The archive narrows here, from the deep place Titan was trying to reach to the 5 names carried in the record of the dive. That narrowing matters. Public stories about disasters often turn people into symbols quickly, Adventurers, passengers, experts, victims, warnings. The official record does something colder, but also more durable. It lists the occupants. It places them aboard one vessel, on one dive, under one operational system, on one morning in the North Atlantic. In the U.S. Coast Guard factual presentation, the 5 people aboard Titan on Dive 88 were Stockton Rush, Paul Henry Nargeolet, Shahzada Dawood, Suleiman Dawood, and Hamish Harding. That is the full manifest at the center of the casualty. There is a discipline to saying only that, and not more than that. The record does not need invented final conversations. It does not need imagined last words. It does not support the legend of 88 hours of voices still recording inside a missing submarine. It supports a smaller and more exact account: 5 occupants aboard a privately operated submersible, descending toward the RMS Titanic wreck site in a craft designed to carry up to 5 persons, including 1 pilot. The number is important because Titan's human capacity and Titan's final manifest were the same size. There was no margin in the passenger count, no empty seat in the story. The National Transportation Safety Board Vessel Particulars described Titan as a passenger-carrying submersible approximately 22 feet long and 9.2 feet wide, built around a pressure vessel for human occupancy. Within that small structure, the expedition carried its full human load. The names appear in an official setting because the casualty was not only a maritime mystery, it became a formal investigation. The U.S. Coast Guard convened a Marine Board of Investigation. The National Transportation Safety Board investigated the engineering and safety questions. NOAA, through a moored passive acoustic recorder associated with the NOAA and National Park Service Ocean Noise Reference Station network, later became part of the evidentiary frame because of the suspected acoustic signature of the implosion. But before there was an acoustic exhibit, before there was a debris field, before there were conclusions about hull failure, there was the roster of the people inside Titan. Stockton Rush was one of the 5 names in that roster. Paul Henry Nargeolet was one of the 5 names in that roster. Shahzada Dawood was one of the 5 names in that roster. Suleiman Dawood was one of the 5 names in that roster. Hamish Harding was one of the 5 names in that roster. Repeated plainly, the list resists the distortion that often follows a widely covered loss. The names are not clues in a puzzle game. They are not characters in a recovered audio drama. They are the occupants identified by investigators in connection with a fatal event on June 18, 2023, during Dive 88 to the Titanic wreck site. The vessel they boarded was not described by investigators as an independent ocean-going submarine. That distinction has already shaped the operating world around this story. Titan depended on the support vessel MV Polar Prince and on a launch and recovery system. Its descent was part of a surface-supported expedition. Its route downward toward Titanic was monitored through communications and tracking until those records stopped. The human scale of Titan is difficult to hold against the scale of the ocean around it. A 22-foot craft near a wreck lying thousands of meters below the surface. 5 people inside a pressure vessel for human occupancy. A Canadian-flagged support vessel above. A search and rescue region spanning remote North Atlantic water. Institutions on shore, later assembling facts from messages, pings, acoustic data, vehicle records, debris, and recovered components. The factual presentation does not ask us to imagine the interior as a scene of dialogue. It asks us to treat the occupants as part of a documented system: a vessel, a dive number, a destination, a launch platform, a support ship, a communications record, and ultimately, a casualty sequence. That is why the chapter of names is also a chapter of boundaries. We can identify who boarded. We can identify the craft's intended capacity. We can identify the destination and the date. We can identify the later findings that all 5 died when the pressure hull failed and the vessel imploded. What we cannot responsibly do is fill the silence with unrecorded voices. That silence is one of the reasons the false legend became so powerful. A missing craft beneath the Atlantic invites the mind to create an interior. People imagine time stretching out. They imagine recordings preserved in darkness. They imagine a returned vessel with no one aboard, or a cache of audio from inside the hull. But the official sources point in a different direction. Titan did not return intact. The evidence later found on the seafloor confirmed catastrophic pressure chamber failure. The documented audio evidence was not an onboard voice recorder. It was a distant, passive acoustic recording of a suspected implosion signature, captured far from the site. So the 5 names must be held without the false intimacy of invented speech. The dignity of the record is not in dramatizing them. It is in refusing to use the gap as permission. There is another reason the manifest matters. In deep-sea operations, the identity of the people aboard is not separate from the question of how risk is accepted, communicated, and managed. Titan was a privately operated submersible used in expeditions to the Titanic wreck site. The craft's pressure vessel used carbon fiber composite construction with titanium domes and rings. It operated at depths where ordinary rescue is not realistic and where a structural failure of the pressure hull would leave no survivable interval. Those engineering facts are not abstractions when 5 people are inside the vessel. They are the difference between an expedition and a casualty. The official investigations would later focus on the pressure vessel, on delamination, on local buckling failure, and on implosion. The Coast Guard would later state that the loss of 5 lives was preventable. The National Transportation Safety Board would identify OceanGate's inadequate engineering process as the probable cause of the hull failure and implosion. Those conclusions belong later in the episode, but their human meaning begins here. Every mechanism named by investigators led back to the same manifest. 5 occupants, 5 fatalities, 1 final dive. The archive presentation of the names also places the event back inside time. These were not anonymous figures in a mythic undersea disappearance. They boarded Titan during a real expedition from the operating world of the Polar Prince in the North Atlantic southeast of St. John's, Newfoundland, and Labrador, with the Titanic wreck as the destination. The location was remote, but not imaginary. The depth was extreme, but measured 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1. The dive had a number. The vessel had particulars. The communications had timestamps. The investigation had exhibits. Mystery remains in this story, but it is not the mystery of ghost voices. It is the quieter and harder mystery of how a known vessel, carrying a full complement of 5 people, continued into a hazardous environment under assumptions that would later be tested by the ocean itself. For now, the record holds them at the threshold. Stockton Rush, Paul-Henri Nargeolet, Shahzada Dawood, Suleiman Dawood, and Hamish Harding. 5 names attached to a small submersible built for up to 5 persons, including 1 pilot, 5 people entering a pressure vessel for human occupancy before a descent toward the most famous wreck site in the Atlantic. The next fixed points are not biographies. They are times. About 8:30 local time, boarding. 9:14, disengagement from the launch platform. Between those 2 moments, the manifest became a crew inside Titan, and Dive 88 moved from preparation into descent. Between boarding and descent, the record becomes unusually narrow. It does not give us private conversations inside Titan. It does not give us a complete emotional map of the morning. It gives us operational anchors. About 8:30 local time, the crew boarded. At 9:14 local time, Titan disengaged from the launch platform. Those times matter because they are not legend. They are the kind of details that survive in a factual presentation, ordinary, procedural, almost plain. And in a deep ocean casualty, plain details become the framework that keeps the story from drifting into invention. The date was June 18, 2023. The place was the North Atlantic, in the operating area for an expedition to the RMS Titanic wreck site, hundreds of nautical miles southeast of St. John's, Newfoundland, and Labrador. The support vessel was the MV Polar Prince. Titan was the submersible. The dive was identified in the Coast Guard record as Dive 88. The morning did not begin in the archive as an emergency. It began as the continuation of an expedition pattern. Surface support, launch and recovery, occupants entering a compact pressure vessel for human occupancy, and a planned descent toward a known deep-water target. The Titanic wreck site was not an unknown destination. It was the object of the expedition, a mapped and famous location at extreme depth. But familiarity does not make that environment forgiving. At that depth, the ocean is not background. It is a load, pressing on the vessel from every direction. By about 8:30 local time, the 5 occupants were aboard Titan: Stockton Rush, Paul-Henri Nargeolet, Shahzada Dawood, Suleiman Dawood, and Hamish Harding. The archive gives us their names, the vessel, the date, and the boarding time. It does not ask us to imagine final statements or hidden recordings. It asks us to understand what boarding meant in practical terms. To board Titan was to enter a craft built around a pressure vessel. It was not a conventional ocean-going submarine operating independently from the surface. It was a submersible dependent on a support operation, including the Polar Prince and the launch and recovery system. That dependence is part of the timeline. The dive did not begin with Titan simply sailing away. It began with the vessel held within a larger system, a surface ship, a launch platform, communications, tracking, and procedures intended to carry a small craft from the human world above into the dark water below. The Coast Guard records phrase that the crew boarded at about 8:30 also marks a change in status. Before that time, the 5 names were expedition participants preparing for a dive. After boarding, they were occupants inside Titan. The vessel's capacity, as described by the National Transportation Safety Board, was up to 5 persons, including 1 pilot. On Dive 88, that capacity was full. There is a temptation, when looking backward from a catastrophe, to treat every routine action as ominous. A hatch closing, a platform lowering, a final glance from deck to vessel. But the archive does not support that kind of scene-making. It supports something quieter and more troubling, that disaster can begin inside ordinary process. The morning of Dive 88 was not documented as a cinematic rupture. It was documented as a scheduled deep-sea operation moving through its early steps. At 9:14 local time, Titan disengaged from the launch platform. That is the second anchor. It is the point at which the craft separated from the support structure that had held it at the surface. In the language of the operation, the launch and recovery system was the bridge between Titan and the Polar Prince. Disengagement meant Titan was no longer simply an object being carried or positioned by the platform. It had entered the dive. The time matters because everything after it becomes a descent record. 9:14 is the line between preparation and exposure. Above that line are the visible elements of a maritime operation: a support vessel, a platform, crew, weather, deck procedures, the physical presence of the submersible. Below that line, the vessel begins moving into a region where human access is narrow and mediated. From that point forward, the surface can monitor and communicate, but it cannot simply reach down and correct the ocean. The Titanic wreck lay at a depth listed in the Coast Guard presentation at about 3,355 meters, or 11,007 feet. The final ping later recorded from Titan would be at an approximate depth close to that range, but on the morning timeline at 9:14, the craft had only just begun the descent. The danger was not only the destination. It was the entire vertical route, the passage through a water column that would steadily increase the pressure on the hull. Titan's pressure vessel, as later described in investigative material, used carbon fiber composite construction with titanium domes and rings. That engineering detail belongs more fully to the later technical record, but it casts a long shadow over this morning. On the surface, the craft could be handled, boarded, launched, and tracked as a functioning submersible. During descent, however, its central promise was being tested minute by minute, that the pressure vessel for human occupancy could maintain a survivable internal space against the rising external pressure. This is why the official times are so important. They let us reconstruct the event without pretending to know more than the record allows. About 8:30, the occupants were aboard. At 9:14, Titan disengaged numerically. Those 2 times show a sequence that appears ordinary only if separated from what followed. With the later findings in view, they become the opening measurements of a failure still hidden inside the dive. The surface operation continued after disengagement. Titan did not become independent in the way a conventional submarine might. It remained part of a monitored expedition system. The Polar Prince was still the support vessel. Communications and tracking still mattered. The planned route still led toward the Titanic wreck site. But the nature of the risk had shifted. The submersible had left the recoverable world of deck and platform and had entered the ocean column. The archive does not tell us that anyone on the surface knew, at that moment, that Dive 88 would become Titan's final dive. It does not describe an immediate alarm at 9:14. It records the procedural fact of separation. That restraint matters. Mystery, in this case, is not served by exaggeration. It is sharpened by the gap between what the operation appeared to be and what the physical evidence would later show. A routine descent toward Titanic carried all the accumulated assumptions of the vessel, the expedition, and the support system. The craft had a name, a destination, a full complement of occupants, and a dive number. Dive 88 was not a mythic number when it appeared in the record. It was an operational designation. It became haunting because it was attached to the last known dive of Titan. From 914 onward, the story becomes increasingly dependent on messages and tracking. The people inside Titan were no longer visible from the Polar Prince. Their presence in the archive would be carried by communications, pings, timestamps, and later by physical evidence from the seafloor. That is the defining change of the morning. The 5 who boarded became, for the surface, a signal-bearing craft descending through deep water. The North Atlantic did not need to announce danger. It imposed it silently, through pressure. Every meter downward increased the load on the pressure vessel. Every minute moved Titan farther from immediate human intervention. At Titanic depth, the ordinary language of rescue becomes difficult. At the surface, time can feel manageable. Under thousands of meters of water, time and distance belong to different rules. So the morning of Dive 88 holds still in the record as a short sequence of documented transitions. The crew boarded at about 8:30 local time. Titan disengaged from the launch platform at 9:14. The dive that began from a support operation near the surface became a descent toward a deep wreck site southeast of Newfoundland and Labrador. Nothing in those 2 anchors alone reveals the moment of catastrophe. They simply mark the opening of the final known operation of the vessel. After 9:14, the record does not widen. It tightens. It becomes a chain of communication entries, tracking points, and silence measured against expectation. The next fixed points are no longer boarding and launch. They are messages from the descent, ending with a brief operational phrase at 10:47 and 27 seconds local time. Dropped 2 watts. 6 seconds after that, the final ping would place Titan at an approximate depth of 3,346 meters. After 9:14, the archive stops feeling like a departure record and begins to resemble an instrument trace. The human part of the morning remains mostly outside the documented file. What remains inside it is narrower, a sequence of communications, tracking information, and operational phrases passed between Titan and the surface support system above it. That narrowing is important. It is also where the false legend often tries to enter. A disaster at depth leaves a silence large enough for rumor. In that silence, stories can grow around imagined recordings, imagined final conversations, imagined hours of voices preserved from inside the pressure vessel. But the documented communications record does not support that version. It does not give 88 hours of speech. It does not give a recovered voice archive from inside Titan. It gives a final descent, a last documented message, a final ping, and then a failure of contact. The vessel in that record is Titan, operated by OceanGate Expeditions during Dive 88 to the RMS Titanic wreck site. The support vessel was the MV Polar Prince. The date was June 18, 2023. The setting was the North Atlantic, southeast of St. John's, Newfoundland and Labrador, in the region of the Titanic wreck site. The descent was not occurring in open independence as a conventional submarine might operate. Titan was a submersible dependent on its surface support operation. That dependence made communications and tracking more than background details. They were part of how the dive existed as an organized operation. The archive does not need to invent drama for the descent. The depth itself supplies the context. Titan was moving downward toward a wreck site listed in the Coast Guard presentation at roughly 3,355 meters, or 11,007 feet. At that scale, the sea is no longer an environment that can be entered casually by human bodies or ordinary equipment. It is a pressure regime. Every meter downward increases the load on the pressure vessel for human occupancy. Every assumption built into the craft matters more as the water column grows heavier above it. That is why the communications record has a particular weight. It is not just a transcript of routine messages. It is one of the few remaining ways to follow the last known motion of the vessel before the casualty. Each entry is an anchor in time. Each tracking point places Titan not in legend, but in an operational sequence. The official record identifies the last message from Titan at 10:47 and 27 seconds local time. The wording was brief, dropped to WTS. There is no need to dress that phrase in imagined emotion. In the archive, it reads as an operational report. The abbreviation WTS is presented in the Coast Guard factual material as part of the message itself. The meaning sits inside the routine language of a dive system, a short note from the submersible to the surface. It is easy after the fact to stare at those words and search for something larger. But the record does not say that it was a farewell. It does not say that the occupants knew what was about to happen. It says only that this was the last documented message from Titan. The exactness of the time matters. 10:47 and 27 seconds local time is not an approximate memory or a later reconstruction from rumor. It is a timestamp in an investigative timeline. In a case where so much public attention drifted toward speculation, that timestamp becomes a guardrail. It keeps the story tied to what investigators could document. 6 seconds later, at 10:47 and 33 seconds local time, the final ping was recorded. Titan was at an approximate depth of 3,346 meters. That number places the vessel very near the deep environment of the Titanic site. It also marks how far the operation had moved from any ordinary idea of rescue or intervention. At a depth of more than 3,000 meters, Titan was beyond the reach of conventional diving. The link to the surface was not a convenience. It was the only practical connection between the submersible and the people tracking it above. The final ping is not the same thing as a final message. It is a tracking point, a last known signal in the record. The distinction matters because the public story has often blurred different kinds of evidence together. Text-style communications, tracking pings, acoustic recordings, search reports, debris findings. In the documented sequence, each has its own role. The message at 10:47 and 27 seconds was communication from Titan. The ping 6 seconds later was the last recorded tracking signal. What came after was not a continuing record of voices. It was an absence that had to be interpreted operationally. There is a quiet brutality in the closeness of those two times. A message, then 6 seconds. A final ping, then no documented continuation from the submersible. But even here, the archive should be read carefully. Investigators can mark the last message and the last ping. They can identify the later moment when the Polar Prince sent a lost tracking message and received no response. They can compare those records with acoustic evidence and debris findings. What they do not provide is an interior scene. This is where restraint becomes part of accuracy. The 5 people aboard Titan were real. Stockton Rush, Paul Henry Narjulet, Shahzada Dawood, Suleiman Dawood, and Hamish Harding. Their names are not made more real by invented last words. The record honors them more plainly by refusing to replace evidence with theater. The last documented words from the vessel are not a conversation. They are not a confession. They are not a long recording. They are dropped to WTs. The depth attached to the final ping also points forward into the engineering record. Titan's pressure vessel for human occupancy used carbon fiber composite construction with titanium domes and rings. Later findings by the National Transportation Safety Board would focus on delamination, local buckling failure, and implosion. Those mechanisms belong to another part of the archive, but their shadow is already present here. At 3,346 meters, the pressure vessel was operating in the environment for which its design assumptions mattered completely. The communications trail does not, by itself, explain the failure. It only shows the last observed approach to it. That is one of the difficult features of this case. The final message is not a cause. The final ping is not a diagnosis. They are markers just before the documented record falls away. For the surface operation, however, a missing signal was not abstract. Titan depended on coordination with the Polar Prince and the launch and recovery system that had placed it into the water. When tracking and communications behaved as expected, the surface team had a way to follow the dive. When they did not, the descent became something else, a missing contact event far below ordinary reach. The gap between a last ping and the recognition of lost tracking would become one of the next fixed intervals in the record. At 10:47 and 33 seconds local time, the final ping placed Titan at approximate depth. At 10:49 and 50 seconds local time, the Polar Prince sent a lost tracking message and received no response. Between those times, the documented descent had already crossed into silence. The archive does not give us voices continuing in the dark. It gives us a last operational phrase, a last tracking point, and then the beginning of unanswered contact. From there, the story changes shape. It is no longer only a descent toward Titanic. It is an emergency forming at the surface around a submersible that can no longer be reached. From the surface, the change was not dramatic at first. It was a missing return in a system that depended on returns. A message sent down, no answer coming back up. A tracking expectation broken. In the record, the moment is fixed with unusual precision. At 10:49 and 50 seconds local time, the Polar Prince sent a lost tracking message to Titan and received no response. That is the point where descent becomes absence. The wording matters. Lost tracking is not the same as a confirmed wreck, and it is not the same as a known implosion. At that moment, the surface support vessel did not have the full explanation that later investigations would assemble. It had a submersible below, a last documented message from Titan at 10:47 and 27 seconds local time, a final ping 6 seconds later, and then no continuing contact. The last message had been operational, dropped 2 WTs. The final ping placed Titan at an approximate depth of 3,346 meters. Then the surface system tried to re-establish the chain. No response. In shallow water, a loss of contact can still leave many possibilities open. A vessel may surface unexpectedly. Divers may be able to return under their own power. Support boats may reposition, listen, search visually, or work within a range where ordinary equipment still has meaning. But Titan was not in shallow water. It was operating near the depth of the RMS Titanic wreck site, a deep North Atlantic landscape where the Coast Guard factual presentation listed the wreck depth as about 3,355 meters, or 11,007 feet. At that depth, the environment itself narrows the emergency. There is no simple ascent team waiting below. There is no quick physical intervention from the surface. There is only the system that has been built before the dive begins: the support vessel, the launch and recovery system, the tracking method, the communications procedure, the emergency plan, and whatever external help can be summoned across hundreds of miles of ocean. That is why the word submersible remains important here. Titan was not a conventional submarine, moving independently through the ocean with the same kind of autonomy people may imagine from military or naval vessels. It was a small passenger-carrying craft, built around a pressure vessel for human occupancy, operated by OceanGate Expeditions, and supported at the surface by the MV Polar Prince. It depended on that surface operation not only to launch and recover it, but to remain connected to the dive as an event being managed from above. When tracking was lost, the emergency did not begin with wreckage. It began with uncertainty. Uncertainty is difficult to narrate because later evidence pulls the mind backward. Once investigators have debris, once acoustic evidence is reviewed, once the National Transportation Safety Board and the U.S. Coast Guard Marine Board of Investigation describe hull failure and implosion, the earlier silence can seem obvious. But the record at 10:49 and 50 seconds local time was not yet the record of recovered debris. It was the record of a surface vessel failing to hear from a craft that was supposed to remain part of an operational chain. That chain had already become thin. The documented communications from the descent were not a stream of conversation. They were text-style operational entries and tracking points. The archive does not support the legend of 88 hours of recorded voices. It does not place listeners inside Titan after contact was lost. It gives a last message, a last ping, and then a surface message that went unanswered. The missing response changed the meaning of every earlier detail. The launch from the platform at 9:14 local time was no longer just the beginning of another Titanic expedition dive. The boarding at about 8:30 local time was no longer only a morning procedure. The final message, dropped 2 WTs, was no longer just one entry among others. In a loss of contact event, the archive becomes retrospective. The last normal item becomes the last known item. The last position becomes the search problem. The last depth becomes a measure of what cannot easily be reached. 3,346 meters is not just a number in this case. It is a boundary between human intention and physical limitation. The pressure at those depths is immense. The cold, dark water does not allow for casual inspection. Even locating an object on the seafloor requires specialized equipment, and recovery is more difficult still. The remotely operated vehicle that later found Titan's aft tail cone and other debris was not an ordinary search device. It was a deep water system from Pelagic Research Services, a 6,000-meter class remotely operated vehicle. The NTSB report names Odysseus capable of reaching 6,000 meters, or 19,685 feet. But that was later. On June 18, 2023, at the moment of lost tracking, the surface did not yet have that visual confirmation. The Polar Prince was operating in a region tied to St. John's, Newfoundland, and Labrador, and the Titanic wreck lay far offshore in the North Atlantic. The NTSB described the casualty location as about 370 nautical miles southeast of St. John's. Distance mattered. Depth mattered. The support vessel mattered. A missing contact event in that place was not a local problem with a quick circle search. It was an event that would require coordination, specialized assets, and decisions made under incomplete information. The U.S. Coast Guard Rescue Coordination Center, Boston, would become part of the response because the Titanic wreck area fell within its search and rescue region. Canadian and U.S. coordination would become central to the public search. Aircraft, ships, remotely operated vehicles, and expert teams would become part of the wider effort. But the first shape of the emergency was smaller and more stark. A support vessel sending a message to the submersible below and receiving nothing back. That silence had two meanings at once. Operationally, it meant the surface team could no longer reliably track or communicate with Titan. Narratively, it marked the moment when outsiders would later begin to imagine what might have been happening inside. This is where rumor finds space. When a craft disappears, people fill the gap with voices, tapping sounds, emergency oxygen calculations, desperate messages, and imagined final hours. But the documentary record demands a more careful line. It does not give us an onboard recording. It does not give us continuing voices from the pressure vessel. It does not support the claim that the missing submersible returned empty. Titan did not return intact. It was later found as debris on the seafloor. The hard part is that, in real time, those conclusions were not available to the people on the surface. A lost tracking message is not an answer. It is an alarm in the form of a question. Where is the craft? Is the tracking system failing? Is communication interrupted? Has Titan begun an emergency ascent? Is it disabled? Is it intact? Is it already beyond rescue? Those questions define a missing contact emergency. They also show why planning matters. The National Transportation Safety Board later noted that better emergency planning could have saved time and resources, even though rescue was not possible after a catastrophic implosion. That finding holds two ideas together. One is procedural. Emergency response systems need to be ready before contact is lost. The other is physical. If the pressure hull fails at extreme depth, there may be no rescue window to use. At 10:49 and 50 seconds local time, the people managing the dive from the surface were at the beginning of that uncertainty. The official record later ties the casualty to hull failure of the pressure vessel, with mechanisms including delamination, local buckling failure, and implosion. But the surface event began as lost tracking. That is the operational face of catastrophe before catastrophe is confirmed. The phrase feels small compared with what it carried. Lost tracking. Two words pointing to a vessel below the reach of ordinary response, carrying 5 people, dependent on a support operation above, descending near one of the most studied and symbolically charged wreck sites in the world. 2 words that turned a dive log into a search problem. The North Atlantic did not answer through Titan's communication system. But elsewhere, far beyond the immediate search area, another system was listening for a different kind of signal. Not voices. Not messages from inside the pressure vessel. Not the imagined sound of people surviving for hours in the dark. A moored passive acoustic recorder associated with the NOAA and National Park Service Ocean Noise Reference Station Network had captured something else, a suspected acoustic signature from the moment the ocean itself registered the failure. That other system was not looking for Titan by name. It was not part of the conversation between the submersible and the Polar Prince. It was not waiting for a text message from the descent, and it was not built to capture words spoken inside a pressure vessel for human occupancy. It was listening in the broader, older way that ocean instruments listen, continuously, patiently, without knowing in advance which sound will become important. Far from the Titanic wreck site, a NOAA moored passive acoustic recorder, associated with the NOAA and National Park Service Ocean Noise Reference Station network, registered a sound that investigators later treated as central to the case. The U.S. Coast Guard described it as the suspected acoustic signature of Titan's implosion. The recorder was about 900 miles from the implosion site. That distance is one of the details that makes the record feel almost unreal. 900 miles is not the range of ordinary human hearing. It is not the range of a radio exchange between a surface ship and a deep-diving craft. It is a distance across ocean basins, across moving water, across temperature layers and pressure gradients. And yet the sea is not silent, and sound does not behave underwater the way it behaves in air. In the archive, this is where the public legend begins to separate sharply from the documented case. The recording was not a voice recorder from inside Titan. It was not an onboard device that survived the destruction of the submersible and came back carrying the final thoughts or conversations of the 5 people aboard. It was not evidence of 88 hours of voices continuing after contact was lost. The official materials do not support that story. What they do support is narrower and in some ways more haunting, an ocean sound record captured by a stationary listening instrument consistent with a catastrophic event at depth. The number 88 belongs to the dive designation. Dive 88. It does not mark 88 hours of recorded survival. It does not transform the casualty into a long underwater vigil. In the record we have been following, Titan's last documented message was sent at 10:47 and 27 seconds local time, dropped 2 WTs. 6 seconds later, the final ping placed the submersible at an approximate depth of 3,346 meters. At 10:49 and 50 seconds, the Polar Prince sent a lost tracking message and received no response. Those are the fixed points in the operational timeline. The acoustic record belongs beside them, not as a transcript, but as another instrument trace. It is important to slow down here, because the words used around this evidence can change the entire shape of the story. Recording can suggest a microphone in a room. Audio can suggest voices, breath, panic, or speech. But a moored passive acoustic recorder in the ocean is not a black box in the aviation sense, and it is not a cockpit voice recorder. It is a passive listening system positioned in the marine environment to collect sound. Passive means it listens without sending out its own signal. It does not interrogate the water like active sonar. It does not ping and wait for a return. It records the acoustic environment around it. Natural sounds, biological sounds, weather-driven noise, vessel noise, and, rarely, the sudden acoustic signature of an unusual event. The NOAA and National Park Service Ocean Noise Reference Station network was created for a different kind of long-term attention. Its purpose is tied to measuring ocean ambient sound over time. That work matters because the ocean has a soundscape, and that soundscape is affected by ships, storms, marine life, geologic activity, and human activity. A recorder placed in that network is part of a scientific listening system, not a rescue device waiting beneath a particular expedition route. And still, because it was listening, it caught something. The U.S. Coast Guard's description is careful. The recorder captured the suspected acoustic signature of the implosion. Suspected is not a decorative word. It tells us that the sound was interpreted in relation to the known event, the time frame, and the investigation. It also reminds us that this is not the same thing as an eyewitness account. It is data, not narration. A pressure event leaves a signal. Investigators compare that signal with other records. They place it against the timeline. The mystery, then, is not whether a lost voice recorder was recovered from Titan. There is no source-grounded basis for that claim. The mystery is how a vessel that had gone silent to its own support ship could leave a mark in an entirely different archive, one designed to listen to the ocean itself. This is the quiet force of acoustic evidence. It does not behave like a message. It is not addressed to anyone. It does not say where it came from in plain language. It has to be interpreted. Time, distance, pressure, and propagation all matter. The sound has to travel through water, and water is a medium shaped by depth and temperature. At great distances, the ocean can carry some low-frequency sounds far beyond what intuition expects. That does not mean every sound survives the journey clearly. It means some events are energetic enough and some paths through the ocean are favorable enough that a remote recorder can preserve part of what happened. In Titan's case, the event under investigation was not a slow leak or a stalled engine. The National Transportation Safety Board would later focus on hull failure, delamination, local buckling failure, and implosion. The pressure vessel for human occupancy was central to the casualty. It used carbon fiber composite construction with titanium domes and rings. At the depth of the final ping, the surrounding pressure was extreme. A catastrophic failure of the pressure boundary would not unfold like a long emergency inside an intact cabin. It would be sudden. That distinction matters because it is where the acoustic evidence becomes morally important as well as technically important. The distant recording has sometimes been pulled into a more sensational version of the story, a version built around prolonged voices, hidden audio, and a missing submarine that somehow returned empty. But the official record points away from that version. Titan did not return intact. It was later found as debris on the seafloor. The acoustic record does not preserve 5 people speaking after disaster. It likely preserves the ocean's response to the destruction of the pressure hull. There is a difference between a mystery and a rumor. A rumor expands into empty space. It fills silence with imagined dialogue. It turns missing contact into hidden survival. A documented mystery does something harder. It accepts the limits of what can be known and then studies the few things that remain. Here, the remaining things are sparse but powerful. A last operational message. A final ping at depth. A lost tracking message with no reply. A distant passive acoustic recorder that registered a suspected implosion signature from about 900 miles away. Later, debris on the seafloor would give the physical confirmation. But before the debris field was found, before the aft tail cone and other pieces were located, by a Pelagic Research Service's remotely operated vehicle, the ocean had already held one kind of record. Not a message from Titan, a sound from the water around it. The recorder did not know the names Stockton Rush, Paul Henry Narjuel, Shahzada Dawood, Suleiman Dawood, or Hamish Harding. It did not know the history of the RMS Titanic wreck site, or the symbolism carried by a descent toward that place. It did not know that the submersible was operated by OceanGate Expeditions, or that the Polar Prince was on the surface, or that an unanswered message would soon become the beginning of an emergency response. It simply listened, and that is why the acoustic evidence sits at the center of this chapter of the record. It is impersonal, but not empty. It is distant, but not irrelevant. It gives investigators a trace from the moment when mechanical failure became catastrophe. It also forces the story back into discipline. If there was a recording, what kind of recording was it? If there was sound, what sound could it plausibly be? If the ocean carried evidence across 900 miles, what did that evidence actually contain? The answer is quieter than the legend and more exact. The recorder captured an ocean acoustic event associated with the implosion, not human voices from within the submersible. That boundary matters. Without it, the story becomes another myth attached to a disaster. With it, the record becomes sharper. The North Atlantic did not give up a final conversation. It gave up a signal. And to understand what that signal can tell us, we have to understand the kind of listening that captured it. Passive acoustic monitoring, a science built not around the drama of one moment, but around the long patience of hearing the sea. The phrase listening to the ocean can sound almost poetic, but in the archive it has a technical meaning. A passive acoustic recorder does not ask the sea a question. It does not send out a pulse and wait for a return. It does not behave like active sonar, searching for a target by putting energy into the water. It waits. It records pressure changes moving through the ocean as sound. That distinction matters here because the recorder associated with Titan's final dive was not looking for the submersible in the way a search vessel might look for a missing craft. It was part of a broader listening effort associated with the NOAA and National Park Service Ocean Noise Reference Station Network, built to measure long-term ocean ambient sound. Its purpose was not to collect a final message. Its purpose was to understand the soundscape of the ocean over time. Ambient sound is the background condition of the sea. It includes natural sound and human-made sound. Wind and waves contribute to it. Marine life can contribute to it. Ships contribute to it. Weather, distance, depth, and seafloor shape can all change what is heard and how it travels. A passive recorder, placed on a mooring, becomes a fixed witness to that changing acoustic environment. It does not know which sounds will later become important. It only preserves a record of what reached it. This is why the NOAA recording is so striking. According to the U.S. Coast Guard, a NOAA-moored passive acoustic recorder about 900 miles from the implosion site recorded the suspected acoustic signature of the implosion. That fact is easy to misunderstand if it is detached from the science around it. The distance does not mean the recorder heard speech from Titan. It does not mean a microphone was inside the pressure vessel. It does not mean the final hours of the occupants were captured somewhere in the water. It means that an energetic underwater event produced a sound that propagated far enough through the ocean to be detected by an instrument designed for long-term passive listening. In other words, the record is powerful because it is limited. The ocean is an efficient medium for some kinds of sound. Under the right conditions, low-frequency acoustic energy can travel great distances. That is one reason passive acoustic monitoring is valuable for ocean science. It can document sound over long periods without requiring a vessel to remain constantly on station. A moored instrument can sit in place through ordinary days, storms, quiet intervals, and passing noise, producing a continuous or scheduled archive of the underwater soundscape. But long-distance ocean sound is not the same thing as a clear recording of everything that happened at its source. A catastrophic structural failure can create a sharp acoustic event. Human voices inside a sealed pressure vessel for human occupancy, surrounded by the machinery, structure, water, distance, and noise of a deep ocean environment, are a different category of sound altogether. The official materials do not support the claim that human voices were recorded for 88 hours. They do not support the claim that Titan returned empty. They support something narrower and more consequential. The suspected acoustic signature of an implosion was recorded at a distance. This narrowing changes the mystery. It removes the false intimacy of imagined last words and replaces it with the harder question of physical evidence. What did the ocean record at the instant Titan failed? What kind of sound does a pressure hull collapse make when the surrounding water rushes into a space that had been holding back extreme pressure? What can an acoustic trace tell investigators when the craft itself is no longer intact? The answers belong partly to acoustics and partly to engineering. Passive listening can help locate a moment in time. It can corroborate that a sudden event occurred. It can preserve a signature that investigators may compare with other data, communications, tracking, depth, debris location, and the known timeline from the support vessel. But passive listening cannot turn silence into dialogue. It cannot reconstruct words that no supported record shows were captured. It cannot make an ambient ocean recorder into an onboard cockpit recorder. That is one of the central lessons of this case. The public story around a disaster often reaches for human sound first. Voices, knocks, messages, signs of survival. Sound feels personal. It suggests presence. It suggests that someone is still there, still trying to be heard. In the Titan record, however, the sound that matters most is not personal in that way. It is structural. It is the sound of failure entering the ocean as energy. The phrase suspected acoustic signature is careful, and the care matters. It does not overstate what the recording proves by itself. It identifies the sound as associated with the implosion within the investigation's broader body of evidence. That body of evidence includes the final communications from Titan, the last ping at approximate depth, the lost tracking message from the Polar Prince, and the later discovery of debris on the seafloor. The acoustic record does not stand alone as a complete explanation. It stands as one layer in an archive built from separate systems that were never designed to tell a single story. That is why passive acoustic monitoring is both humble and extraordinary. It listens without knowing what will matter. A moored recorder may spend most of its life gathering ordinary ocean sound, the background against which unusual events become visible, or rather, audible. Its value is cumulative. Long-term listening creates context. It shows what the sea usually sounds like in a given region and period. Then, when an abrupt and unusual signal appears, investigators can ask why it is there, when it occurred, and whether it aligns with other known events.
For Titan, the timing is central. The official timeline already showed
A brief final sequence, a last documented message from the submersible, a final ping seconds later, then a lost tracking message from the Polar Prince with no response. The passive acoustic record adds a different kind of time marker, one not produced by the communication system and not dependent on Titan continuing to function. If a pressure vessel fails catastrophically, the event can announce itself to the ocean even when every onboard system is gone. That is the terrible clarity of implosion. It is not a gradual message sent upward. It is a mechanical event. At Titanic depth, the external pressure is not a background detail. It is the dominant fact of the environment. A pressure vessel for human occupancy exists to keep that pressure out. If the structure can no longer do that, the transition from intact volume to collapsed wreckage is not slow in any human sense. The acoustic signature belongs to that transition. This is also why the myth of 88 hours of voices is more than an error. It points attention in the wrong direction. It imagines endurance after the point when the evidence indicates catastrophic loss. It turns dive 88, a documented dive designation, into a duration unsupported by the record. It asks us to listen for speech where the archive gives us structural failure. The more disciplined question is not what was said afterward. It is what failed then. And that question leads back from the recorder in the water to the object that had to survive the descent, Titan's pressure vessel. The acoustic trace marks the moment the ocean heard the failure. To understand why there was a failure to hear, the investigation had to move from sound to structure, from the long patience of passive monitoring to the materials and mechanisms of the hull itself: carbon fiber composite, titanium domes and rings, delamination, local buckling, and the final implosion of the pressure chamber. The acoustic trace carried the story only as far as the moment of failure. It could mark a violent change in the water. It could help anchor the timing of catastrophe against the last messages and the final ping. But it could not, by itself, explain the structure that gave way. For that, the archive turns inward, away from the distant recorder, and toward the pressure chamber at the center of Titan. In the National Transportation Safety Board record, Titan is described not as a mythic object and not as a conventional submarine, but as a passenger-carrying submersible built around a pressure vessel for human occupancy. That phrase is clinical, but it is the essential phrase. The pressure vessel was the inhabited space. It was the part of the craft that had to keep the ocean out while allowing people to remain inside, at depths near the Titanic wreck site. Everything else on the vehicle mattered to the operation, but the pressure vessel mattered to survival. Titan's pressure vessel used carbon fiber composite construction, with titanium domes and rings. The language is spare, and it should remain spare. Carbon fiber composite, titanium domes, titanium rings. These are not background design details. They are the reason the engineering archive becomes central. The investigation was not only asking where Titan was, or when communications ended, or what sound the ocean recorded. It was asking how a pressure hull built from those materials behaved under repeated deep ocean loading, and how its condition before the casualty dive may have shaped the final sequence. At the depth of the Titanic wreck site, pressure is not a dramatic metaphor.
it is the operating environment.
The ocean presses on every exterior surface of the pressure chamber, and the chamber must resist that load without allowing a path inward. A vessel designed to carry people cannot fail gradually in the way many surface structures might. Once the pressure hull loses its ability to maintain its shape and boundary, the outside water does not politely enter. The energy stored in the pressure difference is released in a catastrophic inward collapse. That is why the word implosion appears in the official findings and why it carries such weight in this case. The National Transportation Safety Board's focus on delamination, local buckling failure, and implosion gives the chapter its engineering grammar. These are not decorative technical terms. They describe a chain of concern. Delamination refers to separation within a layered material. In a carbon fiber composite pressure vessel, the integrity of the material depends on layers working together. If layers separate, the structure can no longer be understood as simply whole in the same way. Local buckling failure describes a loss of stability in a region of the structure, a localized deformation under load. Implosion is the catastrophic endpoint, the pressure chamber failing inward under the surrounding ocean. Those mechanisms matter because the investigation did not treat Titan as merely missing. Once debris was located on the seafloor and the nature of the event became clear, the pressure vessel became the central object. It was no longer enough to reconstruct the timeline from the polar prints or to compare the last communication with the acoustic record. The physical question moved to the hull itself. What condition was the pressure vessel in before Dive 88? What damage existed? How did the combination of design, material behavior, and prior use relate to the final failure? The vessel particulars help keep the scale of the object in view. The National Transportation Safety Board listed Titan as about 22 feet long and about 9.2 feet wide. It could carry up to 5 persons, including one pilot. The small scale can be misleading. A compact passenger-carrying craft operating near the Titanic wreck site is not a simple small machine. It is a life-supporting pressure system working in one of the least forgiving environments accessible to human technology. The cabin was not simply a room. It was the protected volume inside a pressure boundary, and the strength of that boundary was the central fact on which the dive depended. Titan's construction also placed the investigation inside a specific category of engineering concern. Titanium domes and rings are different in material and behavior from a carbon fiber composite cylinder. A hybrid pressure vessel brings different components into one structural system. The archive does not require us to invent private warnings or unseen conversations to understand why investigators paid close attention. The official record itself tells us the relevant materials and mechanisms. Carbon fiber composite construction, titanium domes and rings, delamination, local buckling, implosion. The path of inquiry is already there. In a mystery built from lost contact and distant sound, the pressure vessel is the part that resists rumor. It gives the investigation a physical center. There were no supported records of 88 hours of voices. There was no returned empty submarine. There was a submersible, a final dive, a lost tracking message, a suspected acoustic signature of implosion, and then debris. Between those points lies the engineering question: what happened to the pressure hull under load? The National Transportation Safety Board determined that OceanGate's inadequate engineering process was the probable cause of the hull failure and implosion. That conclusion places the event in the domain of process as well as material. A pressure vessel for human occupancy is not only a shape, it is also an accumulation of design choices, analyses, inspections, operating decisions, and evidence about condition over time. The hull is a physical object, but it is also the record of how that object was justified for use. When the object fails, investigators look not only at the broken pieces, but at the reasoning that allowed the object to be put into the water. This is why the terms in the report are so important. Delamination is not just damage. It is damage within a material system whose strength depends on internal continuity. Local buckling is not just bending. It is a stability failure, a point at which a region can no longer resist the external pressure in the intended way. Implosion is not just an accident word. It is the physical result of the surrounding sea overwhelming the pressure chamber. Together, these terms move the story from the surface search to the structural sequence. The archive also forces a careful distinction between what is known and what is imagined. The official findings identify mechanisms, materials, and contributing conditions. They do not give us a final interior recording. They do not provide spoken last moments. They draw attention instead to the pressure vessel's construction and condition. In that sense, the pressure hull becomes the true recorder of the final dive. Not because it preserved voices, but because its failure left evidence in the form of debris, damage patterns, and investigative conclusions. There is a quiet severity in that. The public story often reaches for something human and audible, a message, a voice, a final exchange. The engineering archive offers something colder but more answerable. It asks whether the pressure boundary remained intact. It asks what happened inside the composite structure before the final descent. It asks how pre-existing damage and later damage may have affected the hull's ability to withstand pressure. It asks whether the vessel carried the marks of failure before the ocean completed the process. By the time investigators reached the pressure vessel, the central mystery had become narrower and more exact. The question was not whether Titan could still be found alive after an implosion. It could not. The question was how the hull reached the point where implosion occurred. That meant examining the carbon fiber composite structure, the titanium interfaces, and the failure mechanisms named in the record. It meant following the evidence back before the final loss of tracking, before the acoustic signal, before the public search, into the history of the pressure chamber itself. And that history did not begin at the moment of collapse. The National Transportation Safety Board found that existing delaminations and additional damage between dive 82 and the casualty dive contributed to local buckling failure. That finding draws the investigation toward the days and dives before dive 88, when the pressure vessel was not yet debris on the seafloor, but an inhabited structure carrying damage that would become central to understanding why the final descent ended as it did. The pressure vessel's story, then, has to be read backward from the instant when it could no longer hold back the sea. Not backward into rumor, and not into imagined sounds from inside the chamber, but into the documented condition of the structure before Dive 88. The National Transportation Safety Board's finding gives the archive its direction. Existing delaminations, together with additional damage that occurred between Dive 82 and the casualty dive, contributed to local buckling failure. That sentence is technical, but it is not abstract. It describes a chain of physical conditions inside a pressure vessel for human occupancy. Titan was built around a carbon fiber composite pressure vessel joined to titanium domes and rings. At the depths associated with the RMS Titanic wreck site, that structure was not simply carrying passengers downward. It was resisting an immense external load from the surrounding ocean. Every descent compressed the pressure vessel from the outside. Every ascent brought it back towards surface conditions. The investigation did not treat the hull as a symbol or as a mystery object separate from physics. It treated it as a structure with a history. The important word in the finding is existing. The delaminations named by the National Transportation Safety Board were not described as appearing only at the final second. Delamination is a separation within a layered material. In a composite structure, where strength depends on the relationship among fibers, layers, and bonding material, a separation can change the way load moves through the hull. It can create local areas where the structure no longer behaves as a continuous whole. At shallow depth, such damage might not immediately reveal the full danger it represents. At deep ocean pressure, the same damage can matter differently. This is why the investigation's language is careful. It does not need a dramatic theory about the last moments. It identifies mechanisms: delamination, additional damage, local buckling failure, and implosion. These are not separate stories. They are parts of one sequence. Existing delaminations reduced the local integrity of the pressure vessel. Additional damage between Dive 82 and Dive 88 further affected the structure. Under the load of the casualty descent, the hull reached a point where a local region could no longer carry the pressure as designed. Local buckling followed. After that, in a pressure chamber at extreme depth, the transition from structural instability to catastrophic implosion would have been sudden. Local buckling matters because it narrows the field of attention. The failure did not have to begin with the entire hull collapsing evenly, all at once, in a perfectly uniform way. A pressure vessel can fail when a weakened area loses stability under compressive load. Once one region buckles, the surrounding structure may be forced to carry load in ways it was not able to sustain. In Titan's case, the National Transportation Safety Board tied the fatal failure sequence to the condition of the pressure vessel before the final descent. That is the center of this chapter. The final dive was not the beginning of the damage story. It was the last load placed on a damaged structure. The date of the casualty, June 18, 2023, anchors the public timeline. The dive designation, Dive 88, anchors the operational timeline. But the NTSB finding reaches into the smaller interval between Dive 82 and that final dive. It does not require us to invent what happened on each undocumented moment between those dives. The finding itself is enough to show why investigators looked at the pressure vessel as a cumulative object. It had undergone previous operations. It had a material condition. It had areas of damage. By the time it descended toward the Titanic wreck site on Dive 88, the hull was carrying more than the 5 occupants listed in the official record. It was carrying the consequences of its own structural history. This is one of the quiet difficulties of composite pressure vessel investigation. Steel, titanium, and other metals have their own failure modes, but carbon fiber composite structures can present damage in ways that are not always obvious from the outside. The material is not one uniform mass. Its strength depends on fibers and resin acting together, layer after layer. When layers separate, when bonding is compromised, when a damaged area changes stiffness, the structure's response under load can change. The NTSB's finding does not ask the audience to diagnose those changes from a photograph or a myth. It places them in the formal language of structural failure. Titan's pressure vessel was the human boundary. Inside was 1 atmosphere for the occupants. Outside was the North Atlantic at a depth measured in thousands of meters. The U.S. Coast Guard factual presentation placed the Titanic wreck depth at about 3,355 meters. The final ping from Titan on the casualty dive was recorded at an approximate depth of 3,346 meters. At that range, the margin between ordinary operation and disaster is not forgiving. The hull is not merely a container. It is the one engineered barrier between life and the instantaneous consequences of pressure. The last documented message from Titan, dropped to WTS, belongs to the communications record. The final ping belongs to the tracking record. The suspected acoustic signature recorded by the distant NOAA moored passive acoustic recorder belongs to the ocean sound record. But the damage before the final dive belongs to the material record. It is quieter than a final text message and less dramatic than a distant acoustic signal. It is also more explanatory. The sound tells us that a catastrophic event occurred. The structure tells investigators why such an event became possible. That distinction helps keep the mystery precise. There is no supported archive of 88 hours of voices. There is no documented return of an empty submarine. There is a privately operated submersible, a final dive to the RMS Titanic wreck site, and a pressure vessel whose condition was central to the National Transportation Safety Board's probable cause analysis. The mystery is not a ghost story hidden in a recorder. It is an engineering and operational record in which damage, materials, inspection, and deep-sea pressure meet. The NTSB determined that OceanGate's inadequate engineering process was the probable cause of the hull failure and implosion. In that context, the finding about existing delaminations and additional damage is not an isolated detail. It is part of a larger conclusion about how the pressure vessel reached the casualty dive in the condition it did. A pressure vessel for human occupancy cannot be treated as though its past loads have no bearing on its future performance. Each exposure to deep pressure is part of the structure's life. Each known or discoverable damage condition matters because the next dive does not test the design in a vacuum. It tests the actual vessel as it exists on that day. By the morning of Dive 88, Titan was no longer a design concept or a specification sheet. It was the built craft operated by OceanGate Expeditions, supported at sea by the MV Polar Prince, and carrying 5 people toward a wreck site about 370 nautical miles southeast of St. John's, Newfoundland and Labrador, according to the National Transportation Safety Board's casualty summary. The occupants could only rely on the pressure vessel doing what it had to do. The hull's strength was not visible in any simple way from inside the chamber. The condition that mattered most was embedded in the material itself. That is what makes the phrase, "before the final dive," so important. Catastrophe often appears sudden because the last moment is sudden. In a deep ocean implosion, the visible end is abrupt. The communications stop. The tracking stops. A sound moves through the ocean. Later, debris is found on the seafloor. But the failure sequence described by investigators did not begin with public awareness of silence. It began with a pressure vessel whose damaged state had already changed. The archive therefore asks for a different kind of attention. Instead of listening for words that were never documented, it asks us to follow the pressure path through a damaged hull. Instead of imagining a prolonged final recording, it points to the brief and catastrophic moment when local buckling became implosion. Instead of treating Dive 88 as an isolated accident, it ties that dive to prior conditions, including the existing delaminations and the additional damage identified between Dive 82 and the casualty dive. Above the wreck site, however, the surface world did not yet have that clarity. When tracking and communication ceased, the immediate response was not a completed failure analysis. It was uncertainty. The Polar Prince had lost contact. Search and rescue systems began to move. Ships, aircraft, remotely operated vehicles, institutions, and families were pulled into the space between what was feared and what could be confirmed. The pressure vessel had already failed, but the people above it were still living in the first hours of a missing submersible emergency, trying to act in the absence of the evidence that would later make the catastrophe unmistakable. Above the wreck site, the first problem was not proof. It was absence. The polar prints no longer had tracking. The expected communications from Titan were not coming back. What had happened below the surface was already fixed in the physics of the North Atlantic, but it had not yet been fixed in the human record. The people at the surface did not yet have the debris field. They did not yet have a remotely operated vehicle looking at the aft tail cone on the seabed.
They had a missing submersible,
5 people unaccounted for, and a deep water environment where uncertainty becomes its own emergency. This is the painful contradiction at the center of the search. The later evidence pointed to catastrophic implosion. The pressure chamber had failed, and after that kind of failure, rescue was not possible. But during the public search, before the debris was found, the visible story was still organized around hope, timing, and mobilization. Aircraft searched the surface. Ships moved toward the area. Agencies coordinated. Families waited. The world watched a rescue effort unfold above a catastrophe that had likely already occurred. That contradiction does not make the search meaningless. It makes it human. Search and rescue begins from what is known, not from what will later be proven. When a vessel is missing, the first responsibility is to act on the possibility that life remains. In the case of Titan, that possibility was shaped by the public understanding of a passenger-carrying craft with limited life support and no restored contact with its support vessel. It was also shaped by the extraordinary depth of the Titanic wreck site. The search area was not a harbor, not a coastline, not a shallow dive site where ordinary divers or conventional recovery equipment could move quickly through the water. It was the deep North Atlantic, roughly southeast of St. John's, Newfoundland and Labrador, in the vicinity of one of the most famous wrecks in the world and one of the least forgiving operating environments on Earth. Titan was dependent on its support operation. It was not an independent ocean-going submarine that could simply surface, report its condition, and return under its own full autonomy. It was a submersible tied operationally to the MV Polar Prince, to launch and recovery systems, to tracking, to text-style communications, and to a surface team that had to interpret silence from far above. When that connection broke, the surface world had to decide what kind of emergency it was facing without the one thing it needed most: confirmation. The National Transportation Safety Board's later work gives this period a sharper outline. The board noted that better emergency planning could have saved time and resources. That statement matters because it does not rewrite the outcome. It does not suggest that a different plan could have reversed a catastrophic implosion. The NTSB's finding sits in a narrower, harder space. Rescue was not possible after the pressure hull failed, but the emergency response still revealed operational weaknesses. Time, coordination, and resources matter, even when the final cause turns out to be unsurvivable. In deep-sea operations, this distinction is not academic. Planning is not only about successful rescue. It is also about knowing who must be notified, when they must be notified, what assets are available, how quickly they can arrive, and what kind of failure scenarios the operation is prepared to confront. A missing submersible at Titanic depth is not a single problem. It can be a communications problem, a navigation problem, a buoyancy problem, an entanglement problem, a power problem, a medical problem, or a pressure vessel failure. Each possibility demands different tools, different timing, and different expectations. But the ocean does not wait for the possibilities to be sorted. The deeper the operation, the narrower the practical rescue window becomes. At the approximate depths involved in the Titanic expedition, human intervention is mediated almost entirely through specialized technology. Remotely operated vehicles, deep ocean search systems, acoustic tools, and surface vessels become the hands, eyes, and ears of the response. Even locating an object is difficult. Recovering people from a disabled pressure vessel would require not only finding it, but reaching it, interacting with it, and returning it or its occupants to safety under conditions that few systems are built to handle. The public search unfolded inside those limits. To those watching from shore, the language of search and rescue could suggest a familiar sequence. A craft goes missing, teams mobilize, time runs down, and rescuers race to reach survivors. But the deep ocean changes the meaning of every part of that sequence. Distance is vertical as much as horizontal. Communications are limited. The surface can be close in latitude and longitude while still being separated from the vehicle by thousands of meters of water. The support vessel may know the last position, the last ping, the last message, and still not know the condition of the craft. That is why the search became so difficult to understand in real time. The final message from Titan had already been sent. The final ping had already been recorded. The Polar Prince had already sent its lost tracking message and received no response. But until physical evidence was found, the official posture could not be based solely on what investigators would later conclude from engineering analysis, acoustic evidence, and debris. The response had to account for uncertainty, because uncertainty is where rescue begins. This is also where rumor found room to grow. In the absence of confirmation, stories filled the dark. Some versions imagined sounds from inside the vessel. Some transformed the dive number into a duration of survival. Some suggested that the craft returned empty, as if the mystery were a ghost story rather than a documented marine casualty. The archive does not support those claims. The supported record points in another direction: a missing contact event, a catastrophic pressure hull failure, a suspected acoustic signature recorded far away by a NOAA-moored passive acoustic recorder, and later, debris on the seafloor. Still, the emotional force of the search is not hard to understand. 5 people had boarded Titan for Dive 88: Stockton Rush, Paul-Henri Narjoliet, Shahzada Dawood, Suleiman Dawood, and Hamish Harding. Their names were not abstractions in a technical report. They were the reason ships moved, agencies coordinated, and the public attention fixed on a patch of ocean far from ordinary life. The search was powered by the obligation to try, even when the operating environment made success increasingly unlikely. The NTSB's observation about emergency planning does not diminish that obligation. It clarifies it. Deep-sea passenger operations require more than confidence in a vehicle's design. They require credible preparation for the moment when contact is lost. That preparation must exist before the emergency, because once a submersible is missing at extreme depth, time becomes both urgent and difficult to use. Every hour spent determining responsibilities, locating capable equipment, or clarifying response procedures is an hour taken from the only period in which intervention might matter for a survivable scenario. In Titan's case, the later evidence showed that the scenario was not survivable. The pressure vessel had failed catastrophically. There was no intact chamber waiting in the dark, no long period of recorded voices, no hidden return. The search above the wreck site was therefore not a race that barely missed saving the occupants. It was a race conducted before the facts were visible, above a seafloor that already held the answer. That is the hardest part to hold in view. The search can be both necessary and, in hindsight, unable to change the outcome. It can be an act of care and a case study in operational limits. It can consume enormous effort while revealing that the decisive event had already happened in an instant. The contradiction is not a flaw in the story. It is the story of how humans respond when the ocean gives them silence first and evidence later. For several days, the surface response remained suspended between these realities. The Titanic wreck site lay below as both destination and backdrop, a deep memorial landscape now joined by a new casualty. Above it, the search continued through coordination, equipment, and hope. Below it, the physical record waited on the seabed. When confirmation finally came, it did not come as a recovered vessel or a rescue. It came through the work of a deep-water remotely operated vehicle. On June 22, 2023, the search crossed from uncertainty into evidence. A machine built to work where people could not go reached the seafloor and found what the surface had been trying to understand. Titan was no longer missing in the operational sense. It was debris. The evidence had been waiting below the search. For days, the surface had been organized around absence. No tracking, no reply, no confirmed location, no recovered craft. Aircraft and ships could move across the search area. Command centers could coordinate. Specialists could calculate endurance windows and drift possibilities. But the decisive archive was not on the surface. It was on the seafloor, at a depth where ordinary rescue language no longer fit the conditions. On June 22, 2023, that archive was reached. At about 10:50 in the morning local time, a remotely operated vehicle from Pelagic Research Services located Titan's aft tail cone and other debris on the seafloor.
The discovery did not restore the missing submersible. It did not open a path to rescue.
It changed the category of the incident. What had been treated operationally as a missing vessel search became confirmation of a catastrophic failure. The distinction matters because until the debris was found, the public story still had room for uncertainty. Search operations can continue inside uncertainty. Families can wait inside uncertainty. News reports can fill uncertainty with speculation, hope, and error. But debris has a different authority. It does not explain everything by itself, but it fixes the event in the physical world. The aft tail cone on the seabed said that Titan had not remained intact. The other debris around it pointed away from a disabled craft and toward a violent structural event. This was the final physical archive of Dive 88. The machine that reached it was not a rescue submarine. It was a deep-water, remotely operated vehicle, a tool built for a world where human bodies cannot go directly. In the National Transportation Safety Board material, the deep-water ROV Odysseus is identified as a remotely operated vehicle capable of reaching 6,000 meters, or 19,685 feet. That capability placed it well within the depth range of the Titanic wreck site and the surrounding seafloor, where Titan had been descending on June 18th. Odysseus was part of the class of equipment that changes deep ocean investigation from theory into contact. A support vessel can arrive above a location. Sonar can search. Acoustic analysis can suggest. But an ROV can descend through the water column, arrive near the bottom, illuminate the seabed, and send images back to the people above. Its cameras and manipulators become the eyes and hands of the investigation. In this case, what they found was not a single intact object. It was a debris field. That phrase can sound abstract, almost technical enough to hide the violence behind it. But in a deep-sea casualty, a debris field is a map of separation. It records what remained after pressure, structure, and motion finished their work. It records where parts came to rest. It records the difference between components that were outside the pressure boundary and the chamber that was supposed to protect human life from the ocean. The aft tail cone was significant because it was identifiable. It gave investigators and search coordinators a clear link to Titan. Tail structure is not the pressure vessel itself, but it is part of the craft's body and external form. Finding it on the seafloor, separated from other elements, supported the conclusion that the submersible had suffered a catastrophic event rather than a simple loss of power, entanglement, or communications failure. The pressure chamber failure was the central fact. Titan had been built around a pressure vessel for human occupancy, using carbon fiber composite construction with titanium domes and rings. The purpose of that vessel was to preserve an internal environment for 5 occupants while the ocean outside applied enormous pressure. At the depths associated with the Titanic expedition, the margin between a functioning chamber and total collapse is unforgiving. If the pressure boundary fails, the result is not a slow flooding sequence like the imagined dramas of surface storytelling. It is implosion. The debris discovery was therefore not only a location event, it was a forensic threshold. Before that moment, the search could still be described publicly in terms of possibility. After that moment, investigators could begin to treat the wreckage as evidence of the failure sequence. The distant acoustic record, the final communications, the final ping, the known descent profile, and the condition of the pressure vessel all began to converge around the same conclusion. The ocean had recorded a suspected acoustic signature. The surface had recorded silence after lost tracking. The seafloor now held the material remains. Each archive had limits. The acoustic recorder, about 900 miles away, could not tell anyone what was happening inside the vessel. The final message, dropped 2 WTs, could not explain the pressure vessel's internal condition. The lost tracking message from the Polar Prince showed the moment of operational alarm, not the full mechanism of failure. The debris field, too, had to be interpreted carefully. It was evidence, not a complete story on its own. But unlike rumors, it was real. There was no empty returned submarine. There was no documented 88 hours of human voices still recording from inside the craft. The number 88 belonged to the dive designation. The sound record belonged to passive acoustic monitoring. The physical record belonged to the debris on the seafloor. By June 22nd, those distinctions were no longer simply corrections to a public myth. They were the structure of the case. The location of the debris also connected Titan's loss to the deeper geography of the expedition. The craft had been descending toward the RMS Titanic wreck site, southeast of St. John's, Newfoundland, and Labrador, in the North Atlantic. That setting had already shaped every operational risk. It placed the dive far from ordinary emergency response, in extreme depth, near a wreck that is both memorial and archaeological landscape. Now the seafloor near that landscape contained a second wreckage record, separated from the 1912 disaster by more than a century, but joined to it by destination and depth. For investigators, recovery and documentation would matter, because wreckage is where engineering claims meet physical consequence. Materials, fracture patterns, separated components, and recovered parts can speak more directly than promotional language or operational confidence. The National Transportation Safety Board would later focus on delamination, local buckling failure, and implosion. Those are not theatrical words. They are mechanism words. They describe how a pressure vessel can lose its ability to resist the sea. The debris field gave those mechanisms a place to be studied. It also closed the search in the way no one wanted. Search and rescue had been built around the possibility of life. The discovery of the aft tail cone and other debris confirmed that the event had passed beyond rescue at the moment of failure. The painful contradiction from the previous days became clear. The world had been watching a search above a catastrophe that had already happened. That does not make the search meaningless. It makes it human. In deep-sea incidents, confirmation often arrives late because the environment withholds evidence. The surface can know that something is wrong before it can know what happened. It can mobilize without certainty. It can spend time, resources, and hope trying to resolve absence. Only when a machine like Odysseus reaches the bottom does the ocean begin to give back the record. And what it gave back here was final. Titan was no longer a contact to be restored. It was no longer a craft awaiting communication. It was a wreckage site. The investigation could now move from emergency response toward accountability, from locating debris toward understanding why the pressure vessel failed and why the operation had been allowed to carry people into that risk. The seafloor discovery did not end the questions. It sharpened them. Once the aft tail cone and debris confirmed catastrophic failure, the central issue became less about where Titan was and more about how the conditions for its loss had been created. The official record would turn toward engineering process, damage history, oversight, and prevention. The debris on the seabed was the last physical page of Dive 88, but it was also the first page of the judgment that followed. 5 people had died in a loss that investigators would not treat as an unavoidable mystery of the deep. The debris field made the loss visible, but it did not make it simple. Once Titan was no longer being treated as a missing craft, the investigation entered a different kind of depth. The question was no longer whether the submersible might surface, or whether it might be found intact, or whether rescue equipment could still reach it in time. The question became how a passenger-carrying submersible had reached the Titanic wreck site with a pressure vessel that investigators later tied to delamination, local buckling failure, and implosion. That shift matters because it changes the emotional shape of the record. A missing submersible emergency leaves room for hope, even when that hope is narrowing. A casualty investigation does not. It asks whether the loss belonged only to the ocean or whether the conditions for it were made before the dive began. In the official conclusions, the answer was severe. The U.S. Coast Guard Marine Board of Investigation stated that the loss of 5 lives was preventable. That word is not decorative. In maritime investigations, preventable does not mean that the ocean was safe, or that the Titanic wreck site was forgiving, or that deep submergence could ever be made routine. It means that investigators found causes and conditions that did not have to exist in the form they did. It means the final dive was not treated as an unavoidable act of nature. It was treated as the endpoint of decisions, design choices, operational practices, and oversight gaps. The National Transportation Safety Board reached a closely related engineering conclusion. It determined that OceanGate's inadequate engineering process was the probable cause of the hull failure and implosion. In the language of an accident report, probable cause is not rumor, not a theory offered from a distance, and not a dramatic reconstruction. It is the investigator's formal judgment about why the casualty occurred. The central object in that judgment was Titan's pressure vessel for human occupancy. Earlier in the archive, that vessel had appeared as a design fact: carbon fiber composite construction, titanium domes and rings, a compact craft built to carry up to 5 persons, including 1 pilot, toward extreme depth. In the final conclusions, that same pressure vessel became the place where process and physics met. The National Transportation Safety Board found that existing delaminations and additional damage between Dive 82 and the casualty dive contributed to local buckling failure.
This is a quiet sentence with a heavy meaning.
Delamination is not a mythic failure. It is a material condition, a separation within a layered structure. Local buckling is not a cinematic event. It is a structural instability, a place where a loaded component can no longer hold the shape required of it. At the depth of the Titanic wreck, small margins become decisive. The surrounding pressure is not an atmosphere of danger in the abstract. It is a force pressing against the pressure hull from every direction. The board's conclusion tied that force to an engineering process it found inadequate. The failure was not described as simply the sea being too deep. It was described through the relationship between damage, design, analysis, inspection, and operation. The mystery narrows there. It is no longer a story about the deep ocean as an unknowable place. It becomes a story about whether a craft intended to take people into that place had been engineered, evaluated, and overseen in a way equal to the risk. This is where the regulatory record becomes important. The National Transportation Safety Board stated that Titan was not registered in any U.S. state. It was not documented by the U.S. National Vessel Documentation Center. It was not inspected by any flag state. These facts do not describe the sound of the implosion. They describe the environment in which Titan existed before the implosion. A flag state, in maritime practice, is more than a label on paperwork. It is part of the legal and inspection framework under which a vessel is identified, regulated, and held to standards. Documentation and registration create official channels of responsibility. Inspection creates another layer of scrutiny. The investigative record's point was not that paperwork alone could hold back the North Atlantic. It was that Titan occupied a space where the ordinary structures of maritime accountability did not operate in the way the public might assume for a passenger-carrying craft. That distinction had been present from the beginning, even if it was easy to miss. Titan was not a conventional submarine. It was a privately operated submersible, dependent on a surface support operation and a launch and recovery system. The support vessel, MV Polar Prince, operated from St. John's, Newfoundland and Labrador, carrying the expedition toward a wreck site hundreds of nautical miles offshore. Titan descended as part of that operation. It was not an independent vessel crossing the ocean under its own command. It was a small craft built around a pressure vessel, taken to a remote site, launched into a depth where direct human intervention becomes almost impossible. That arrangement created a particular kind of risk. It also created a particular kind of ambiguity. To someone following the story from the surface, the presence of a support ship, paying passengers, a known destination, and repeated expeditions could imply an ordinary safety structure. But the official record shows a more complicated picture. Titan was carrying people into an extreme environment while not being registered in a U.S. state, not documented by the U.S. National Vessel Documentation Center, and not inspected by any flag state. Those details matter because prevention is never only one action taken at the final minute. Prevention is a system of earlier decisions. It includes the design and testing of a pressure vessel. It includes how damage is identified and interpreted between dives. It includes whether a novel structure, such as a carbon fiber composite pressure hull joined to titanium elements, is being evaluated with enough rigor for repeated deep ocean service. It includes emergency planning, communications procedures, oversight, and the willingness to stop when the record of the craft no longer supports confidence. The Coast Guard's conclusion that the loss of 5 lives was preventable sits beside the National Transportation Safety Board's finding on probable cause, like 2 parts of the same archive. One speaks in the broad language of casualty prevention. The other identifies an inadequate engineering process as the probable cause of the hull failure and implosion. Together, they move the story away from the simpler idea that Titan was merely defeated by a hostile environment. The environment was hostile. That part remains true. The RMS Titanic wreck site lies in a part of the North Atlantic where distance, weather, depth, and darkness all limit response. The final ping placed Titan at an approximate depth of 3,346 meters. The wreck itself rests at a depth where rescue is not a matter of sending divers down, and where every recovery operation depends on specialized equipment. But the official conclusions did not allow that setting to become an excuse. Deep water magnifies consequences. It does not erase responsibility. That is one reason the word preventable feels so stark. It makes the tragedy harder, not easier, to absorb. If a loss is imagined as sudden fate, it can be placed at a distance. If it is judged preventable, it comes back toward the people, organizations, and systems that allowed the final chain to remain unbroken. It asks what was known. It asks what should have been known. It asks what forms of confidence were accepted in place of evidence. The public myth around this case often tries to fill the silence with invented sound. A returned empty submarine, 88 hours of voices, recordings that official sources do not support. But the official conclusions are more unsettling because they do not need those inventions. They give us a colder record. A submersible on dive 88. 5 occupants. A final documented message. A final ping. A pressure vessel with documented damage history. A suspected acoustic signature of implosion recorded far away by a NOAA moored passive acoustic recorder. Debris on the seafloor. And then, after the search and recovery, the formal judgment that the loss was preventable. That judgment also changes how the acoustic evidence should be heard. The sound from 900 miles away was not a ghost transmission from inside the craft. It was not the continuation of voices after contact was lost. It was the ocean registering an event that the surface did not yet understand. Later, when the debris field and engineering findings were assembled, that distant sound belonged to a larger pattern. It was one trace among many, not a supernatural clue, but a physical one. In the end, the official record does not make Titan less mysterious by explaining it. It makes the mystery more precise. The unknowns that remain are not invitations to invent a returned vessel or hidden recordings. They are the hard unknowns of engineering margins, inspection decisions, operational judgment, and regulatory boundaries. They are questions about how confidence forms around a machine, and how that confidence can survive even when the machine is carrying damage into a place where failure leaves no second chance. By the time investigators used the word preventable, the story had moved far from the first surface reports of a missing submersible. It had passed through silence, search coordination, acoustic analysis, and the discovery of wreckage. It had become something more exacting than a deep-sea disappearance. It had become a case study in what the ocean reveals only after the human systems have already failed. What remained was the archive itself, not the rumor, not the imagined voices, not an empty craft returning from the dark, but the fragments that could be verified. The sea kept most of the moment. The record kept enough. The sea kept most of the moment. The record kept enough. That is where this story has to end, not with the legend that grew around the absence, but with the archive that remained after the absence was examined. The harder version is also the quieter one. Titan did not return empty. There is no documented file of 88 hours of voices from inside the pressure vessel. There is no official record of a recovered submarine drifting back without its passengers, carrying a final human soundtrack from below. There was a submersible on Dive 88. There was a support vessel, the MV Polar Prince, operating from St. John's, Newfoundland and Labrador. There was a descent toward the RMS Titanic wreck site in the North Atlantic, about 370 nautical miles southeast of St. John's. There were 5 people aboard: Stockton Rush, Paul Henry Narjoile, Shahzada Dawood, Suleiman Dawood, and Hamish Harding. There was a final message at 10:47 and 27 seconds local time, dropped 2YS. There was a final ping 6 seconds later at an approximate depth of 3,346 meters. There was a lost tracking message from Polar Prince at 10:49 and 50 seconds. There was no response. And, far from the wreck site, there was sound. The U.S. Coast Guard record describes a NOAA-moored passive acoustic recorder associated with the NOAA and National Park Service Ocean Noise Reference Station network, about 900 miles from the implosion site. That instrument recorded what investigators identified as the suspected acoustic signature of the implosion. Not voices, not words, not a conversation held in the dark for days. A sound in the ocean, captured by a system built to listen to long-term ambient noise across great distances. That difference matters because it changes the shape of the mystery. A rumor asks us to imagine an impossible archive, people speaking for 88 hours inside a vessel that somehow came back without them. The record asks us to look at something more severe, a pressure vessel for human occupancy, failing in deep water, suddenly, at a depth where the surrounding pressure leaves no ordinary path back. One version is supernatural in texture. The other is mechanical. But the mechanical version is not less haunting. It is haunting because it does not need invention. Titan's final record is scattered across systems that were never meant to become memorial objects. A text message in an operational log. A tracking ping. A lost contact message from the surface. A distant acoustic trace on a NOAA recorder. A debris field located by a remotely operated vehicle. Investigative findings from the U.S. Coast Guard Marine Board of Investigation and the National Transportation Safety Board. The archive is not dramatic in the way rumor wants it to be. It is procedural. It is timed. It is technical. It is made of fragments that survived because machines, agencies, and people were recording the world in the ordinary course of work. Those fragments are enough to resolve the central contradiction. The phrase, "Missing Submarine Returned Empty," does not describe the Titan casualty. Titan was not a conventional submarine operating independently under the sea. It was a privately operated submersible that depended on a surface support operation and a launch and recovery system. It did not return intact. On June 22, 2023, a Pelagic Research Services remotely operated vehicle found Titan's aft tail cone and other debris on the seafloor at about 10:50 local time. That discovery changed the public search into confirmation of catastrophic pressure chamber failure. The phrase 88 hours of voices also collapses when it reaches the record. The number 88 belongs to the dive designation. The Coast Guard factual presentation identifies the casualty dive as Dive 88. The audio evidence belongs to passive acoustic monitoring, not to an onboard voice recorder. The documented final words from Titan are not hours of speech. They are the short message, "dropped 2 WTs." That message is unsettling, partly because it is so ordinary. It does not sound like myth. It sounds like an operational update during descent. In the closing shape of the case, the ocean is not a monster, and the archive is not a ghost story. The ocean is an environment where pressure becomes absolute. At the depth of the Titanic wreck, design assumptions are no longer abstract. Materials are not symbolic. Carbon fiber composite, titanium domes, titanium rings, delamination, local buckling failure, implosion, these are not background details. They are the language by which the official record explains how a passenger-carrying submersible became debris. The National Transportation Safety Board determined that OceanGate's inadequate engineering process was the probable cause of the hull failure and implosion. It found existing delaminations and additional damage between Dive 82 and the casualty dive that contributed to local buckling failure. The Coast Guard Marine Board of Investigation stated that the loss of 5 lives was preventable. Those conclusions do not erase grief, and they do not turn the case into a simple moral. But they do place responsibility back into the world of decisions, engineering process, inspection, operational planning, oversight, and the boundaries of confidence. This is why the real archive is more unsettling than the rumor. A rumor can stay weightless. It can drift from channel to channel, changing shape as it travels. It does not have to account for materials, timestamps, search regions, pressure hulls, or regulatory gaps. The archive has to account for all of them. It shows how quickly a deep-sea mystery becomes a matter of engineering. It shows how silence at depth can be misread at the surface because the surface has not yet seen the wreckage. It shows how an acoustic event can travel through the ocean while certainty takes days to reach the public. The 900-mile sound is central because it preserves the scale of the ocean without turning that scale into fantasy. Somewhere far from the Titanic wreck site, a moored recorder heard something consistent with Catastrophe. That does not mean the ocean spoke in human voices. It means the ocean carried energy. It carried the signature of a sudden failure through water, across distance, into an instrument that was already listening. In that sense, the case is not about what the ocean wanted to hide. It is about what human beings could and could not verify.
The surface vessels could search. Aircraft could scan.
Command centers could coordinate.
Remotely operated vehicles could descend.
Investigators could reconstruct timelines, review materials, examine debris, and state conclusions. But the exact instant inside Titan was not recoverable as experience. It was recoverable only as evidence. That is a difficult kind of ending for a mystery story because it refuses the comfort of a final scene. There is no recovered cabin, no complete last conversation, no impossible return. There is only a narrowing of the unknown until the outline is clear. Dive 88 descended toward the Titanic wreck site. Contact was lost. A catastrophic implosion occurred. Debris was found on the seafloor. Official investigations identified preventable failures in the systems that allowed the dive to proceed. What the ocean kept was the human moment inside that failure. What the record kept was enough to tell us that the legend was wrong. And maybe that is the responsibility of an archive report, not to make the story larger than the evidence, but to let the evidence be large enough. The final documents do not need a supernatural echo to be disturbing. They already describe 5 people entering a small craft built around a pressure vessel, descending into a deep North Atlantic landscape where rescue options were vanishingly limited, and meeting a failure that turned communication into silence almost at once. The missing submarine did not return empty. The 88 hours of voices were not there. But the real case remains: a submersible, a final message, a final ping, a suspected acoustic signature recorded 900 miles away, and debris near the Titanic wreck site. That is what the ocean gave back, not the myth. Enough.